It's called breaking the fourth wall. It's one of those times in a TV show or a movie where the characters may have been talking with one another, and then either the narrator who's telling you the background or one of the characters themselves turns and looks at the camera and starts talking to you, recognizing that you're there. And even though it's a jarring thing to hear in a TV show, it actually happens in the Bible, in the Gospel according to Mark. That's where we're headed in this week's conversation of meeting Jesus. So we've been working our way through the Gospel according to Mark, getting to know Jesus, his announcement, his good news, his message, and what it's like to be drawn into his community. And as we've entered into Mark chapter 13, we're in a whole scene sometimes called the Little Apocalypse, where Jesus is talking about signs and warnings of the coming destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And in this scene, Jesus continues to talk, answering the question that the disciples had started with. When will this temple be destroyed? The temple in Jerusalem. And Jesus has begun to give them sort of a response. And we said last time that Jesus' response seems to be almost intentionally vague when he talks about there'll be wars and rumors of wars and famines and pestilence. Well, that could be any time, right? That's not like a single particular moment in history. Those things happen all the time. But then Jesus continues with a more specific kind of a clear kind of a direction. And it's maybe less about when in time, but how do I respond? How do I prepare for this coming time? And as the passage goes along, we get one of those breaking the fourth wall moments where Mark, the narrator, stops and wants us, the readers, to realize we are reading something, and he gives us sort of a knowing wink. Continuing on in verse 14 of Mark 13, Jesus is talking, "But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains." Did you hear that? Let the reader understand? Even in your Bible, that phrase is probably put in parentheses, because that's Mark, the narrator, stopping and going, okay, Jesus just used a phrase that you need to know what he's talking about. And this is one of those moments where we in the 21st century are missing something or are more likely to be unaware of what would have been well known by everybody in Jesus' day. The phrase desolating sacrilege, or sometimes it's translated abomination of desolation. Sounds pretty hefty kind of language there. That's a phrase that everybody in Jesus' time in ancient Judaism would have known and understood. It's a phrase itself that harkens back to the book of Daniel. And there are 3 times in the book of Daniel where the prophet talks about some devastating event that would happen to their temple, and that something would happen that would stop the usual pattern of offering sacrifices, and something would profane it and make it terribly ungodly and wicked. In other words, there would be something that would just absolutely, utterly annihilate the purpose of the temple. And as the book of Daniel talks about it, then when you read the handful of places it comes up, it sure sounds like Daniel is talking about an event that eventually happened in the year 167 BC. It's in this weird time frame that, again, Christians have a hard time learning about, talking about, because it's in the time we usually call the intertestamental period, that is in between the literature we call the Old Testament and the literature we call New Testament, where, at least for Protestants, we don't know, we just don't have the experience or knowledge to know as much about, because we don't have a lot of literature in our Bibles that talks about that. There are other books that tell stories about that time period, but we're just not as familiar with them. But it's a historical fact that in the year 167 BC, when it was the Greek Empire that had conquered and was ruling over the land we call Israel or Palestine or Judea, and a Greek emperor by the name of Antiochus IV, who went by the nickname Epiphanes, God made manifest, by the way, to show and flex his imperial power, to show that he was boss and nobody should question him, he stopped sacrifices being offered, the appropriate sacrifices that were offered in the temple, and instead sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus. This is about the most disgusting, profaning, abomination of desolation kind of thing you can do if you were a pagan king, right? Not just stopping the worship that was happening there, the rightful worship of God, of Yahweh, the God of ancient Israel, but now sacrificing an unclean animal, right? A pig is an unclean, non-kosher animal, and sacrificing this pig to your god Zeus. All of that was meant to just sort of like rub salt in the wound of the conquered Jewish people. We're in charge and you're not, and that this profaned the temple. Like, this is the most utterly devastating and sacrilegious thing you could do. So anyway, Daniel keeps referring to that event in history in the book of Daniel as the abomination of desolation, right? And everybody in Jesus' day who had heard, not only who knew the memory of what had happened, but who had read or heard the book of Daniel knew, oh, that's a terrible thing that happened. And of course, in Jesus' memory, after that terrible time when the Greeks had profaned their temple, later on, there's a sort of purification, a rededication of the temple. It's the story that we call the story of Hanukkah, if you know that story. And for basically 150 years or so afterward, maybe 180 by the time Jesus is an adult, people had lived with this sort of rededicated temple and the memory of how terrible it was when the Greek Empire had done this thing, not just to conquer us and dominate us, but to humiliate us and to profane our worship of God by sacrificing a pig to their own God on our altar. And so Jesus says, now, when you see that kind of stuff happening again, get ready. You should know things are about to get bad again. So again, Jesus, talking in like the AD 30 range, give or take, is telling his listeners, when you start seeing these same kind of things happening again, you should be prepared. Things are about to get bad. Now, it's possible, some people think Jesus is talking about some distant future event when the temple is rebuilt yet again and there's going to be offering sacrifices yet again in a distant future that's distant future to us. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think Jesus is talking to people who are living in his time and place. And in fact, in the year AD 70, just like a generation after Jesus' own time and ministry, things got bad again. And the Romans were now the empire on the scene. And they did surround the city of Jerusalem, burn it to the ground, and knock down the temple. And to this day, it's still destroyed. All that remains is the foundation walls that are called the Wailing Wall today in Jerusalem. In other words, Jesus is sort of warning the people in his own time. When you start seeing things getting bad like they did back when the Greek Empire was on the scene, be prepared. It's about to get bad here in Jerusalem again. It's a warning very clearly for Jesus' time and place, for the people in the first century, saying, when you see the new empire doing the same terrible stuff the old empire did, you should be prepared. It's about to get bad. This is going to be another devastating moment for our people and for our time. And therefore, he says, if you see those things happening, get out of here. You find a different place to go. God's not tethered to just being in this city or this building, but it's okay. Flee wherever you need to go. It almost has the feel of like, if I said to you in our day and time, if I said, when you start seeing people being forced to wear six-pointed yellow stars on their clothes, or when you start seeing people goose-stepping down the streets and saluting, you know things are about to get bad, right? I'm using images, I'm using details that we know from our history about what happened in the era of the Third Reich, when Jewish citizens, Jewish people in Germany and Central Europe were forced to wear yellow stars, and when Nazi soldiers went goose-stepping and saluting through the streets. If I said, when you see that kind of stuff happening again, watch out, it's about to get bad, I'm not necessarily predicting there will be literal Nazis again or a literal new Third Reich again, but I might be saying this pattern keeps happening. Empires keep doing what empires are going to do. When you see those patterns repeating again, read the signs and know not to participate in that and know to get out because things are going to get bad, right? If I start warning you about Nazis and saying, when you start seeing what Nazis are doing, you should be careful and don't be a part of that or be prepared to get out of the way. I'm I'm not saying that people from the 1940s are coming back, but it might be saying fascism has a way of coming back over and over and over again. The playbook is the same. Something similar, I think, is going on in Mark chapter 13 when Jesus makes this reference back to when you see the abomination of desolation, and Mark, the narrator, goes, breaking the fourth wall, let the reader understand, you know what I'm talking about, wink, wink, wink. It's a way of saying those same terrible things we saw the empire do when it was the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire is going to do the same thing all over again. I'm telling you, it's not going to be that different. The letterhead on the empire may have changed, the Romans instead of the Greeks, but they're going to do the same terrible cruelty, and we got to be ready for it this time. Jesus' response isn't that we should, start and fight up, raise up an army and fight back and kill those in the Roman Empire, but say we're not going to fight on the world's terms, but be prepared, be ready. The empire is going to do its terrible, rotten stuff like it always does. Be prepared when this pattern keeps happening again. So again, I don't think this is so much Jesus giving us details or little hints to predict exactly when, in what year or day or month Jesus is coming again, but more to say, watch out. The signs are going to tell you when the new empire is doing what the last empire did, that we need to be ready and you need to be aware of what's going to be happening. Jesus then goes on and offers more direction, but it's interesting that, again, it's less about predicting and more about how you live in a posture of being ready at any time for Jesus coming. So he goes on and says, in those days after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars falling from heavens, and then you'll see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Again, I don't think the idea is to be literally saying that at some point the sun will come crashing down to earth. I'm not sure that's possible, but more to say the things that everybody treats as permanent and fixed and enduring, that even those things will be shaken, right? So be prepared for everything that everybody counts on as solid and dependable. Those things will fail, but I won't. Everything else might come crashing down. Everything else that you build your life on, even the sun and the moon and the stars that everybody counts on to be regular and predictable, those things might fail. But even when everything else falls apart, this is part of the good news. I will be there and I will come to be with you. The imagery Jesus used in the section we talked about last time is that this is like birth pangs, right? Before a birth happens, mom's in these terrible pains of labor. And for anybody who's witnessed or heard or lived through that experience, yeah, it's painful, and yet it's also something worth doing because it brings this life into the world. That it's a pain that isn't simply destructive, it's creative, kind of. It's okay, we will get through this, and on the other side of it, there's new creation, there's new life when a baby is born. Jesus' whole perspective on all this talk about the coming destruction isn't to say it's scary stuff, you should all be afraid, the world's going to come apart and we should either panic or we should fight it off. No, Jesus says when these things happen, I know it's going to be scary, but we're going to get through it, and it will be something that brings forth new creation. It's interesting, the disciples had only been interested in asking the question of when will our precious building be destroyed? And Jesus answers really pointing to something bigger about God's whole new creation and about God making all things new. That God always has a bigger vision than we settle for. Now, all that stuff is going on in Mark 13, and if it seems confusing or dense to us, it may be less that Jesus is trying to give cryptic hints for predicting the end of the world, and more that Jesus is using language and images that people in his day all clearly would have understood, but that we sometimes forget, that we don't have all the historical references, or that we don't catch the things everybody in Jesus' audience would have understood. When Jesus uses that phrase, the abomination of desolation, it's not meant to be an ominous or mysterious phrase. Mark is trying to go, I want you to understand what I'm talking about. Wink, wink. You know that phrase that Daniel used. You know what I'm talking about. To be prepared when empires keep doing what empires are going to do. Bottom line for us is our hope is that Jesus, when he comes, makes all things new. And our lives in the meantime aren't meant to be consumed with fear about either the world falling apart or what will happen when Jesus comes, but to be lived in hope. Okay, it'll be all right. It'll be like when a mom is going through labor and birth pangs. It's painful, but we get through it, and there's new creation that comes through it on the other side. That's the invitation that Jesus is giving to his followers, both in the first century and for us in the 21st century. I'm going to invite you to join us next time for more conversation as we keep meeting Jesus, whether you join us for these video summaries or around the table on Thursdays at 1 o'clock. But thanks for being part of the journey with us.